Vincent, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Vinny LaRocca, I am the CEO of Cybersecurity Operations. We are a cybersecurity, security compliance consulting organization. We've been in business for about 6 years now and growing fast.
And how did you get into cybersecurity?
So my background way back in the day, I worked for IBM some 30 years ago, and I did what we considered network security back then. It really was no cyber security. So always had a little bit of a background when it came to security. About 6 years ago, I came out of an MSP where we recognized the fact that organizations were trying to do the IT technology for businesses and the security, which is a bit of a conflict of interest, right? You're basically checking your own homework. If you're installing and maintaining a network and then you're doing a vulnerability test, for example, most auditors won't allow that. That's a no-no. So, made a decision 5, 6 years ago to kind of separate out and become an MSSP,
Nice,
not a security services provider.
nice. And before we get started in the meat of our discussion, I really love to ask my guests that are in cybersecurity, counter fraud, counter scams. Have you ever been a victim of a cybersecurity scam or fraud? Because if you and I can't get it right 100% of the time, those that aren't in this space, we need to destigmatize these sort of things happening as part of our lives. So, has that happened to you?
Yeah, so I dealt with a fraud issue with my bank where my checking account had gotten breached. It ended up being an internal fraud with the bank. And luckily, I got my money back, but it took a while, right? Somebody had forged a check. They knew what our last actual check was, wrote the next one, were able to forge a signature. Luckily, it wasn't close enough that we were able to win that battle. But I mean, it does happen to just about everybody. And to be honest with you, because I work for a cybersecurity company, we've got so many controls in place that it almost prevents me from making an error that would get me scammed. And if it wasn't for that, I'd probably be on a longer list.
Yeah, I think everybody has had a credit card compromised. And particularly when it's a bank account, it really is a violation of like, oh, they got inside.
Absolutely. And once again, I've seen some individuals that you would think would be the last people on the planet to get scammed, and they've gotten scammed.
It's something that we all should never assume won't happen to us. We need to be prepared for it to happen at some point.
Yeah, quite the opposite. You should assume it's going to happen.
Gotcha. So let's talk about kind of what's going on today in cybersecurity and compliance and where the emerging threats and responses are coming from. So where's kind of the current trends of where you're seeing things move?
A lot of the trend is moving towards AI. I'm sure you're hearing a lot of that. It's in the news every day. Threat actors, those that are looking to exploit our vulnerabilities and take advantage of it, they've started to use AI to automate their attacks and be able to extend their reach. So we've seen the number of potential breaches and breaches grow exponentially over the last 6 to 8 months, and I'm assuming that's going to continue to go in that direction. Now, on the opposite side, we're starting to integrate AI into our monitoring and detection, our response capabilities, and even have industries more prepared to look for AI and understand how they use AI. Another thing that we're a little bit concerned about is now you've got more and more organizations that are using your chat GPT and your Copilot, and these things are utilizing your data and manipulating your data. So you can't just throw it out there and let everybody have free reign as to what they do with it and how they use it. You need to put some parameters around that and make sure you're protecting the data that's yours or your clients, so that it's just not out there on the dark web.
Yeah, that's one of the things that always there was an organization I was talking with them, and they had said, yeah, we're we've gotten questions about how we might utilize AI to find resources within our organization faster. And one of the people was like, "We got a lot of proprietary private information. Let's do this real slow because that's the last thing we want becoming public is what
Right.
we do, the secret sauce of what we do and how we do it, and just kind of personal information that's out there."
Right. And I mean, on top of that, almost every state now has got some sort of data privacy, data protection law. So, if you don't have an understanding of how that AI tool that you're using, maybe manipulating that data and making it available to, resources you weren't aware of, it could get you in a little bit of trouble.
So where so let's talk a little bit about it, and then we'll meander around. When we're talking about a corporation using AI or on their own data, what does that look like, and what does that entail?
Well, I mean, right now, it's an area that is really starting to grow. So I've seen more and more businesses that are using it to summarize meetings, for example, and that's on the low end. But you'll
Yeah.
get some more sophisticated programs. There's a lot of AI integrators now that are using that to take your data and create access to maybe your applications. So I'll give you an example. An organization right now that's taking data out of a CRM and then loading it into a QuickBooks, a program for their accounting. So you're taking data from one place using AI to put it into another place where your original store that you're taking it from, there's a set of rules and there's a set of users that have access to it.
Yeah.
Are you putting it to another place where there's a different set of rules and a different set of users that have access to it? So you need to make sure that you're encapsulating that and you know where it's coming and where it's going and who has access to it.
Yeah, I think that there's this general feeling with a lot of people that like, oh, AI is going to solve everything. AI will sort it all out. Uh, Maybe someday, but we're not quite there yet. It's a mixed bag.
Yes, but it is going to get there. I did hear, and I would love to cite who said it, but I can't recall. Um, there's about 300 companies in the globe right now that are going to spend about $1 trillion in research and development in AI in 2025.
Wow.
So with that kind of investment, AI is not going away. It's only going to continue to grow. So we just need to make sure that as we're growing those tools, we're able to understand what we're doing with it and how we're utilizing it.
Is there, from the cybersecurity side, is there a fear of, maybe not fear is not the right word, a concern that AI will so much exponentially grow the attack surface that you just can't keep up with the attacks and can't keep up with the complexity of the attacks?
Well, there's definitely that fear, and there's a lot of conversations going on around that. Once again, AI is still an unknown, so we're not really sure where it's going to go. We do know that the threat actors are usually one step ahead of us, so they're utilizing that quite a bit now. We would expect that to grow. On the other side, we've got to use that to be able to prevent, right? So if we know they're using it as an attack tool, we got to use it as a defense tool.
And kind of how does that how does that play out for your clients in terms of is it massive hardware, massive costs, or are these things just kind of a relative add-on to things that they've been doing, not just with your company, but in a larger sense?
Uh, Overall, I mean, it's a bit of a cost right now. Really, the issue right now is the hesitation, right? Because it's so new, you've got a lot of businesses, industries that are hesitant to implement something that, is regulation going to come down tomorrow to say, hey, you can't use this, but I just spend a lot of money to do something that I might not be able to use.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of hesitation right now. Just about everybody
Yeah.
is claiming that their tool, their application uses AI. I'm not 100% sure that that's accurate. You'd have to start doing some research because I mean everybody claims that, but I do know that we're going to be using it more and more until somebody tells us we can't, and I don't foresee that happening.
Gotcha. On the attack side, is AI creating new attacks, or is it just more clever? Well, maybe a clever. just using a wider range of things or doing a better job of stringing things together?
For the most part, it's just doing a better job, and it's enabling threat actors to do more attacks quicker. So we do see a lot of sophistication, for example, in phishing attacks. In the past, you'd be able to read an email and be able to get a feel for, was this something that was written with intent, or by the grammar, for example, you can
Hmm.
tell this was coming from overseas, and it wasn't. It was a scam. Now with AI, they're becoming way more sophisticated. They're becoming harder and harder to detect.
Is that
Now,
because is that because they're now starting to integrate kind of data sources into those emails that we now can, in spear phishing, we can now do research on the CEO and find out that he's a 49ers fan and include a reference to that in the email and make it seem more natural to the
sure,
recipient?
sure. I mean, they were doing that before. It just allows them to do it quicker and target a larger audience.
Hmm.
So where, in the past, if they were, let's say they were creating 15 attacks a day, whatever that number is, now you can multiply that by 10.
It's kind of the escalation of when we went from manually hacking to becoming script kiddies to this is the next level.
Correct, yes, to that extent. And why, going back to what we were talking about before, when everybody, we say everybody should assume it's going to happen to them, with the industry growing like it is, I almost feel bad calling it an
Yeah.
industry, but cybercrime is now an industry. Add AI to it, and the amount of money that these threat actors are taking in, they're going to continue to attack more and more organizations. In the past, we would see the smaller organizations have that mindset of, it's not going to happen to me. Nobody wants my data. I don't have that kind of money. It really doesn't work that way. With these kind of automated attacks now, they're just looking for a vulnerability and they're going to exploit it.
Mhm.
So yeah, you're a smaller business, they'll just take less money from you, but they'll still attack you.
Is the kind of the philosophy of smaller businesses like, well, I don't really have anything of value, so why would they attack me? Do you find that with smaller businesses?
Yes, I mean that's less and less today. That was definitely more the mindset over the last couple of years. I think with all the number of breaches that has been in the news, more and more organizations are understanding what they have to do. That in also with all the regulation and laws that are out there now, more and more businesses and industries are required to do something whether they want to or not.
Hmm. I guess it makes me wonder, is a like a cybersecurity compliance officer role becoming a need at larger organizations to make sure the right technology is being used and used in the right way within the regulatory infrastructure for that industry?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of regulations require businesses to have somebody who's qualified to, fill in that type of role as a CISO, for example. One of the services that we actually offer is a fractional CISO. So if you're a small organization and can't afford to have a full-time person in that role, we'll handle that for them.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So what is a CISO and what kind of is their role within an organization?
So CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, uh, you know, it's not like it's evenly spread across every business and every industry how they use them. Some businesses will use that as a catch-all. Hey, anything that has to do with data and security and all falls under this one individual. And some will have a little bit more of a streamlined look at it. But for us, it's really about giving a resource that can look at what your security posture is today. What do you have in place? What should it be? What controls should you have in place? Especially if you're looking at, specific industries, if you're looking to follow a framework or a
Hmm.
standard, you've got HIPAA, you've got NIST, you've got ISO, you got SOC 2, so there's a number of them out there. We'll basically come in, look at where they are today, where they should be, create that kind of roadmap of how they get from current state to future state, and then manage that for them. And an easier way of looking at that is what we call governance, risk, and compliance,
Hmm.
GRC. So we'll help them create a program, implement the program, and then manage that program going forward so that they meet all the criteria of regulations, laws, and the framework that they're looking to adhere to.
I can see that as being a challenging position to roll, and the reasoning why you get a fractional person doing that. Is that almost one of the challenges is that there's not enough people that have the relevant experience and that are current with everything to be able to fulfill that role?
Well, there's a number of things. There's more and more individuals that will have the qualifications for that role on paper, but there's no getting around experience,
Yeah.
right? So having someone that's actually done it and been through the wars, to me, is way more valuable. So we make sure that our people not only have all the qualifications which are required, but have that experience to say, all right, I've been through this. This is how this is going to work.
Yeah, I could see a small business being in a very overwhelming process to having not had someone in that role to even having a fractional person in that role and having to rethink how do we manage our data? How do we manage protecting everything?
Yeah, yes, it's new for, especially in that mid-market, smaller organizational space. It's new to a lot of them. They're used to, what is the minimum requirements I have to have in my IT to get me to be able to run my business. And now you're worried about things like policies and procedures, which is not something they've ever had to really worry about in the past. Regulations are requiring that. And then, as we always say, you don't want to have a policy that says I do X, Y, and Z, and then not be able to do it and enforce it.
Yeah.
So that's even more important. So there's a lot of change that's going on in that mindset for those smaller organizations. Okay, now I gotta say I do this, and I gotta make sure I actually do it.
Yeah, I know the history has been there's definitely a lot of uh, organizations that needed to check a checkbox saying, yeah, I had a pen test done, but they didn't really, but there wasn't the following checkbox. So, well, did you follow all the follow all the recommendations?
Right. Well, and that's almost the difference between security and regulation, right?
Yeah,
So, hey, I meet the regulatory requirements. I checked all these boxes. That doesn't mean you're secure, and vice versa. You can be secure. That doesn't mean you're meeting the regulatory requirements.
yeah. It's yeah. It's
Yeah,
a scary
compliance
it's a scary world, complex world.
is very complex, and security and compliance don't go hand in hand.
You had said that they're kind of I forget the word you used, not necessarily an adversarial role, but that you shouldn't be having one person do both.
Right. It's checks and balances, church and state. Um, just think about that. If you were, I think the example I used is you've got one organization that implements and maintains your network, your server infrastructure, and then you've got that same organization that says, okay, I just did a risk assessment, a vulnerability assessment because some regulation is requiring it. They're not going to come to you and say, you got all these vulnerabilities, all these ports in the because, quite frankly, that's going to potentially make them look bad. So, and auditors don't really allow that. They wouldn't let the same organization provide that kind of information. Checking your own homework.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, if you're building a defense, you're building a defense against the stuff that you know about, not the stuff that you don't know about.
Correct. And really, where we've grown quite a bit over the last, I'd say, 24 months is we work more and more with those IT companies to let them know this is not something where we're in conflict with, we're competing for. We're probably your greatest asset. We protect you, we protect your customer, right? So kind of got to use it that way. We're now part of a team, right? So we'll come in, show them, here are the holes that should be remediated. So listen, you go remediate them. Now you're protecting yourself and your client. Everybody's happy. Don't look at us as your enemy. We're probably the best thing that could happen to you.
What are some of the most common gaps that you see where companies are not taking the right measures to protect themselves and their customers?
So one of the easiest one is patching and what we call hardening, where you're keeping your OS and your systems and your software patches up to date. So there's things that come out every once in a while, what we call a 0-day vulnerability. So some application all of a sudden got exploited with a vulnerability they weren't aware of. Right now, once that gets out there, the threat actor community, they know about it. They're going to go attacking everybody. If you're not patching that whether it is an application or infrastructure, well, now you're vulnerable. So I've seen organizations where they do their patching once a quarter, once every 6 months, which is not really, best practices for that. The other thing is, having a secure password policy, and once again, the controls to maintain that.
Hmm.
We've seen organizations where they say, yeah, we use strong passwords, got to be changed every 60 days, it's got to be 12 characters, except that applies to everybody but the CEO. He doesn't want it, so he's ignored it. And that ends up being where the breach is. So it's actually, everybody's got this understanding or belief that cybersecurity has got to be expensive, when that's really not the case. There's a lot of things you can do, which is very little cost, if any. It's just a matter of paying attention to it.
Has the did the CrowdStrike kind of their patch fiasco, has that made companies more hesitant about patching more frequently or applying real-time measures?
I don't think so. I think for the most part, it's now when we talk about the cyber world, it's a cyber event. One of them's happening all the time, right? So it happens, you learn from it, and you move on. I think the expectation is even that CrowdStrike learned from it, and they're going to be better for it,
Yeah.
right? So it's just like anything else: learn from it and improve.
So for companies that don't have their 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 infrastructure managed by somebody else, and they're a small, 10-person, 20-person shop, what are some of the things, like how should they be managing when it's hiring an outside firm isn't within their budget potentially?
So once again, I mean, we can. I like to talk to them about. Let's talk about your landscape today. What is it you think you have? What is it you believe you don't have, right? And then what is your budget? It doesn't have to be, let's go boil the ocean. Let's take steps to improve your security posture. And what we'll do a lot of is, okay, let's work within your budget. What's the controls that you can put in place that will give you your biggest bang for your buck,
Hmm.
right? And we work that way. And we'll tell them, like, here's our recommendation. So maybe you don't have the budget for it now. When you do, here's something you should really do, because this is a glaring vulnerability. I would think the biggest thing we deal with quite a bit in that mid-market space is most organizations don't know. So when you tell them that they really should do a risk assessment or some sort of vulnerability testing, they feel like they're spending money to do something that they're ultimately going to have to pay more money to do. But I mean, if somebody's coming in and telling you should spend money to put this control in place without knowing what your
Yeah.
vulnerabilities are, well, that's got to be a bigger waste of money. So it's really knowing what you don't know.
Yeah, there's no point in putting a really fancy lock on the front door of your house when the back side of the house the door isn't even there. It's just an open door frame.
Great analogy. Great. I'm going to use that one. I wish I was talking about.
I'll charge you 2 cents for every usage of
Done.
it.
Done.
So aside from patching being a big thing and password management, is there other one or two other areas that are kind of this relatively common? Maybe they've kind of got it right, but most people get it wrong.
I would say logging an audit trail. So when we deal with organizations that do deal with some sort of breach or believe they may have gotten breached, by default, most organizations have an audit trail that gets overwritten every 24, 48 hours. So by the time you come across what you believe may have been a breach or data exfiltration, if your logs are overwritten, if you don't have like a DLP, a data loss prevention solution in place, there's no way to really know. And in that case, you have to act as if you had data loss, and that can get expensive.
Hmm.
So being able to monitor and know what's happening with your data is very important.
Yeah, I could think of a number of situations where there's no logging in place, and if something was exfiltrated, there's no record of it, there's no history of it, there's no anomaly.
And
It's
we've had
just out there.
and we've had organizations that say, "Well, I can't prove it was gone, so I guess I'm good."
We can't prove that anyone took anything, so it must not have happened.
Not have happened. Yep.
I- Are are you guys brought in on kind of ever brought in on managing when a breach has happened, on how to figure out what was accessed, and it kind of like what do you do when there are limited logs available?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a number of tools that, we can go out and look at. We can look at memory, we can pull things from there. Um, but in the end, a lot of times I'll tell organizations up front if they want, especially if they're going to pay us to do forensics and detection, you could be spending a lot of money to find out that there's no way of knowing.
Yeah.
So in some cases, you might be better off just acting as if it happened, which is probably going to be the case anyway. So let's assume it's worst case scenario and take it from there. But yeah, I mean, we do have tools that can do a lot of, and we've got individuals that are skilled at doing forensics. But I mean, I would tell you that's a 50-50, probability.
I guess it helps knowing what happened, but if you still have to go through the same hoops afterwards,
Right,
it,
but a lot of times they'll be, so especially if you've got partners or vendors that are want to know, hey, before I do business with you again, because I was impacted, I
mhm.
need to know that you know what happened and you've remediated it. You can't go to your partners and vendors and say, well, it happened, so we're going to go do some patching and we're all good. We've actually seen that's probably one of the largest growing areas in our cybersecurity space is third-party vendor management.
Mhm.
So now that you've gotten more and more organizations that understand and are becoming sophisticated in the cybersecurity and the regulatory space, knowing what they need to do, they've made that investment to become secure. But if their vendors and partners, especially those that they've been potentially sharing data and infrastructure with, are not doing the same thing, well, you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? So that behavior is getting driven out by those that understand and are more sophisticated.
Gotcha. It's we need our partners to disclose what happened so that we can make sure that we're protected and we're protecting our customers in an appropriate way.
Correct. So we're an ISO 27001 certified organization. So I've got partners and vendors that we'll go to and say, hey, in order to continue doing business with me, you need to meet this minimum criteria, or I'm not going to be able to do that, and you're going to potentially lose business. So as an example, more and more of that is happening. That's really what's happening with CMMC. So that's a certification that came down from the Department of Defense a year or two ago, and basically said if you're part of the supply chain, you need to meet these requirements in order to continue doing business. So you're going to see more and more of that actually happen.
Yeah, and it's what needs to happen. I mean, I can't imagine how many data breaches have happened that we just aren't aware of or will never be aware of that happened. It's the data's out there and it's just been mixed up with so much other data we don't even know where it came from anymore.
Right. I think the last stat I saw was a data breach occurs in the United States every 6 seconds.
That sounds about right. I thought it was about 7 seconds, but
I could be off a second or two. I mean, don't hold me to it, but you get the point.
I mean, I guess it's, kind of puts consumers in the position of you just have to assume that any data that you've ever given to anybody will get out into the public at some point.
Unfortunately, that is a mindset I see more and more of where, individuals and businesses will say, I assume my data is already out there, so I'm not really too worried about it. And even if that's actually the case, as a business owner, I don't want to hear that from somebody that I'm doing business with,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I want to assume it's out there and take appropriate precautions to prevent it from being used in inappropriate ways, but to stick my head in the sand and assume that no one's ever going to get my social security number. Someone's
Right.
going to get it. In fact, I'm sure plenty of people already have it, but
When you come home one day and somebody else is living in your house because it was sold from under you,
yeah.
that's when you're going to say, you know what, somebody had my social security number.
Hopefully, I'll figure it out well before that happens.
Let's hope so.
So, kind of coming back to AI, how long do you think before this, kind of in this inflection point with AI, I think that where we see this great upside, we see great downside, but we kind of don't know where the horizon is or when that horizon is going to get here. When do you see things starting to settle down and kind of reach a new equilibrium?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by settle down, right? So, I mean, I read an article recently where I believe it's Boeing now just came out with an airline that the only reason they'll have a pilot on there is to make the passengers feel comfortable. They really don't need it. It can fly on its own. The landscape, I believe, over the next 2, 5, 10 years is going to change drastically. We're just on the beginning of this AI revolution. And like I said, I deal with AI on the cybersecurity space, so I don't want to pretend to be this savant of what's going to happen in AI and the rest of the globe. But I I believe that these threat actors will use it more and more, become more and more sophisticated, and they're going to identify vulnerabilities that we're not even aware of yet. I mean, that's been the trend historically, so I don't see how that's going to change going forward. Um, some of to be honest with you, one of the few things I think that we can get to that would stop ransomware is when we get to a point where legally you're just not allowed to pay the ransomware.
Yeah.
You have to deal with the fallout. I don't think we're there yet, but if that were to come down, if you're a threat actor and you can't get paid, even if you're successful, that's going to
Yep.
change it.
That kind of stops the financial incentive of if it's now criminal for me to pay to get my data back or pay to unlock my data,
Right. Yeah.
I
I
don't want to
mean,
go to jail.
correct. I mean, somehow they'll find another way, right? But they'll find the next trend. But I mean, that's the only thing that I could even see slowing it down right now.
Mhm.
It's too much money for them, being made.
Do you envision where they're moving next? If ransomware becomes difficult, what's the next soft target, so to speak?
If I knew that, I'd probably to be honest with you, Chris, me and you probably wouldn't be on this call right now. Uh,
You'd be building and selling that solution as quickly as you could.
Correct. Yeah, I really don't. I've been as shocked at some of the things that I've seen already. So I mean, nothing would surprise me. But no, I wish I was out in front of it. I'm not.
Is there any aspect of this that kind of keeps you up at night?
Oh, I mean, all of it. No, especially as a cybersecurity company, right? My biggest fear, and I've got some really great people that work for me. I don't want to be the cybersecurity company that gets breached, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's probably a death knell. So that's one of the things that keep me up at night. So we have, I mean, just about every control you can imagine in place. It takes me about 15 minutes to log on in the morning. But better safe than sorry.
Yeah. Do you see that, like, I don't want to call that paranoia, but that level of security starting to be in more and more everyday organizations, that just becomes part of life?
Yes, for a while I would, deal with a lot of C-level executives that would say it's just not worth it. The impact it's having on my work is it's just too much. So I'll roll the dice, only
Yeah.
to find out that that was a mistake, and they'll go back in the other direction. But the tools that we're using today are getting better and better. There was a time where they were putting a lot of overhead and they were utilizing a lot of resources on your machines. That's kind of gotten corrected, so it's gotten better and better. But I mean, just everybody, right? When you log on in the morning, you're probably logging onto your machine, you're logging
Yeah.
onto the application. You've got two-factor authentication for every one of them. You've got tools in the background that are making sure you don't have data exfiltration. So, there's a lot going on. Even, when somebody sends me an email, I know I'm going to wait 10 minutes before that email gets through all our systems and checks and balances.
Yeah, there's definitely part of my routine is, okay, now which authentication methodology is that second factor? Was that a hardware token? Was it an app? Was it which device does it go to? Does it go to this one? Does it go to that one?
Right, right.
It becomes a little bit of a shuffle. I'm intentionally keeping certain things separate, and then you're like, okay, I just don't know what number am I supposed to enter in that field, and where am I supposed to get it?
Right. And luckily, some of those applications become better also, where the most of these systems will allow you to choose your authentication. So once again, getting better and better. Same thing with like these password creators. They're getting better and better.
I remember having a meal with a family member overseas, and they pulled out their keychain, and this was, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and they probably had like 15 or 20 2FA physical hardware tokens on their keychain because it was where they were living. It was not it wasn't allowed to be SMS, and the authenticator apps weren't really participating yet, weren't in full force yet. So every entity that he worked with had a different physical 2FA token he had to work. I was like, oh, that's much worse than a pile of keys in your pocket because they can stack those
Oh,
tokens were, oh yeah.
yeah, I don't miss those days. I don't miss those days at all. Although now, God forbid you lose your cell phone. I mean, you're at somebody's mercy.
Yeah, yeah, there's I think every methodology for 2FA has a drawback that you have to make sure that you understand, and you have to understand if I lose access to that methodology, how do I regain access without it? It becomes its
Right.
own little challenge.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we lose our cell phone. We have bigger problems than that too, right?
Yes, that's true. So, as we wrap up today, any additional parting advice for either businesses or consumers?
In my parting advice would be, not to turn a blind eye to what's out there. Don't make the assumption that cybersecurity and protecting your data is going to be costly, going to take up a lot of your time. There's a lot of things that you can do that won't cost you a lot of money that will make a big impact to protecting your employees, your customers, your vendors, your partners, and your data. And as we talked about, don't make the assumption it's not going to happen to you. You should make the assumption it's going to happen to you.
Gotcha. And if people want to be able to connect with you or your company, where can they find you online?
So the website is cybersecop.com, cybersecop.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Vincent LaRocca. Always looking forward to meeting new individuals and helping ask questions. And through the website, you can actually contact me in the organization also.
Awesome. We'll make sure to include links to those in the show notes. Thank you so much for the time and coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Greatly appreciate it.